Retirement has fundamentally changed over the last 10 years. Back in 2014, when you got to retirement, either your employer was expected to look after you by providing you with a defined benefit pension, or you're expected to buy an annuity. With both of these options, you would have received a guaranteed monthly income for the rest of your life, which made retiring relatively easy because you just replaced your stable monthly paycheck from your job with a stable monthly paycheck from your pension, and you just cracked on with life. But today, outside of the public sector, defined benefit pensions are rare and annuities are out of favour. Today, you are expected to provide for yourself in retirement by saving into defined contribution pensions, ISAs and other investments. On one hand, these options offer much more flexibility, but on the other, they require you to be disciplined, learn how to invest, and then when you get to retirement, you are the one that has to create an income for yourself. You say goodbye to your salary from work, and then you need to replace that cash flow by drawing down from your assets. But how do you do that? And how do you choose which bucket or which combination of buckets to draw from first? These answers are not obvious. And in a second, I'm going to show you the common mistakes that people make that end up costing them tens, if not hundreds of thousands of pounds in tax. Unless you're lucky enough to have a defined benefit pension that is going to provide all of the income that you need in retirement, this is a skill that you are going to have to learn at some point. And the earlier the better, because this knowledge will also help you to make better decisions in the years and decades before retirement. I am a financial planner. It is my job to help my clients create sustainable, tax-efficient incomes in retirement, and it can be really complicated, but it doesn't have to be. In this video, I'm going to show you the 7-step process that you can implement yourself, which will enable you to solve this problem as well as it can be solved. The final step, step number 7, is arguably the most important, and it's where people make the biggest mistakes. Now, I'm not just saying that so that you watch to the end of the video, although that would be nice. I'll tell you what it is now. Step number 7 is how to decide what to invest in. But most people think that that is step number 1. It's not. Step number 1 is listing out all of the stable income streams you expect to have coming in. Let's look at an example. Graham is 60 years old and is retiring this year. He currently has a buy-to-let property that brings in a profit of £7,000 per year. When he turns 65, he'll have a defined benefit pension that starts paying out £3,000 per year. And then when he turns 67, he's on track to receive a full state pension, which is currently £11,500 per year. Now, of course, here we are projecting decades into the future, and you may have no idea what you want your life to look like then. But don't worry, you do not need this to be 100% accurate to still be able to make good decisions. All you need to do is make the best assumptions that you can. Now, when Graham actually reaches 67, all of these income streams will likely be higher than they are now. But for this first step, it's much easier to think about these cash flows in today's money. And given that each of these cash flows are likely to increase roughly in line with inflation, they'll appear as a straight line on this inflation-adjusted graph. Here we're looking to list out any income streams that are relatively stable and constant. So you might also want to add in income from part-time work, annuities, or other benefit payments that you might receive. All of these income streams are taxable, but if you have some that aren't, add them in last or add them to a separate graph. The second step is to then understand how much you think you'll need to sustain your quality of life in retirement and to identify the shortfall that we need to make up. Let's say that Graham is looking to spend £3,300 per month or £40,000 per year throughout retirement, which would appear as a straight line on this graph because, again, we're assuming that this expenditure would increase in line with inflation each year. In reality, his spending is likely to be perhaps higher at the start of retirement when he's more active, then drop as he slows down into his 70s, and then perhaps pick up again if he needs later life care. But for the sake of this example, let's just keep it simple and assume a constant spend. This would give him a shortfall of £33,000 at the start of retirement, but this would reduce as his other income streams come online. So to sustain himself in year 1, Graham needs to find an additional £33,000 of cash flow net of tax. Step 3 is to list out the assets which he could draw this money from. Let's say he has £30,000 in cash and cash ISAs, £100,000 in stocks and shares ISAs, and £400,000 in a defined contribution pension, with both of these accounts being invested in globally diversified portfolio of stocks and bonds. Now, you might be thinking, if I'm expecting to have less than this in retirement, is this video still relevant for me? Absolutely. This process is relevant for anyone that is going to need to rely on their investments for an income in retirement. Step 4 is for Graham to assess whether his spending target of £40,000 per year is likely to be sustainable given the assets that he has. Because if it's not, and he starts drawing too much at the start of retirement, he could end up having to make drastic changes to his lifestyle later on if he runs out of money. To help assess sustainability, we would typically build a financial model either by making linear assumptions about future growth rates or stress testing the plan using historical data or Monte Carlo analysis. This is a pretty important step, but because I have covered these techniques in a lot of my other videos that I'll leave some links to down in the description, I'm not going to cover this in detail here. But let's say that we've done this analysis and then we're comfortable that Graham's desired level of expenditure is likely to be sustainable. Step 5 is to work out how large a cash buffer you need and how you're actually going to manage your cash flow on a monthly basis. Now, I'm sure you've heard of the concept of having an emergency fund, a pot of cash to help you manage unexpected costs and to help you take a long-term view with the rest of your investments. Well, in retirement, this is even more important. The moment that you retire and become dependent on your investments for income, you're going to start looking at the day-to-day fluctuations of your investments in a very different way, which is why having a cash buffer will not only help you to manage your monthly cash flow, but it will also help you to feel more secure and to ignore short-term fluctuations of the stock market. The size of that buffer will depend on what you feel comfortable with, but it should also factor in what other regular income you have coming in and how much risk you're taking with your other investments. But for Graham, let's say that we've landed on a figure of £30,000. Now, just like an emergency fund, this is a permanent cash buffer. He should not eat into this unless something unexpected happens. What we're going to look at in step 6 is how we then draw down the cash he needs to sustain him in that first year. We need to find an extra £33,000 net of tax, and we can take it from either of these buckets. His pension is actually split into 2 distinct buckets because 25% of your pension is tax-free, which you can draw down as a tax-free cash lump sum or in little bits as you need it over time, whilst the other 75% of your pension will be taxed at marginal rates of income when you draw it down. So what's the most tax-efficient way that he could draw £33,000 from these buckets? The obvious answer would be to take it from his ISA or the tax-free part of his pension. If he did that, there would be no tax to pay. And he could keep doing this perhaps for 7 or 8 years without paying any tax before he fully depletes these buckets. Which sounds great, but if we fast forward to 68, when he's only got the taxable part of his pension left, and his other income streams are using up his personal income tax allowance, he's going to end up paying 20% tax on everything that he takes out of his pension. This is the thing. The game when it comes to pensions is to get as much tax relief as you can when you're putting money in and pay as little tax as you can when you're taking money out. The taxable part of your pension is the problem bucket, so you need to be tactical with how you use the tax-free buckets to help you pay as little tax as possible when you're drawing from it. As little tax, not just in the first year, but over your lifetime. So if you're ever presented with an opportunity to draw down from the taxable part of your pension, which means that you can avoid paying more tax in the future, it's likely to be a good move. Let me show you. Graham currently has £5,570 of his personal allowance left over, which means that this year he could draw £5,570 from the taxable part of his pension without paying any tax, which means that he can then preserve his tax-free buckets for slightly longer and use them to avoid paying 20% tax in the future, saving him £1,393 in tax per year at a minimum. It could be way more than this. We're assuming here that Graham's spending is going to increase in line with inflation. But if income tax bands do not also rise with inflation, the future withdrawals he has to make from his pension could end up being pushed into higher tax brackets. Given that income tax bands have already been frozen until 2028, there is a significant chance that this could happen. And with the way things are going, it looks like tax rate themselves could also rise. So this may end up saving him a hell of a lot more. What's more is that every pound of tax you save is an extra pound that gets to remain invested and keep growing, which means that this approach could save him 30, 40, perhaps even £50,000 over his lifetime. If he did this and took £5,570 from the taxable part of his pension, he would also need to take the corresponding 25% tax-free cash. So he would be drawing £7,426 tax-free. This means he still has a shortfall of £25,500. So which bucket should we take this from? This answer is not so obvious or black and white because again, it depends on how much tax Graham thinks he'll pay in the future. If Graham draws this money from the taxable part now, he's going to pay 20% tax. So if Graham thinks that at any point in the future, he's likely to pay a higher tax rate than 20%, then drawing it down now is likely to make sense. If he thinks he'll pay less tax in the future, then he would be better off taking the money from a tax-free bucket. And if he thinks he'll pay the same amount of tax, then it's a bit of a toss-up between these three. So he could hedge his bets and maybe take a little bit from each, or if one of the buckets is much larger than the other, he could try and even that out a bit to help spread the risk of future legislative changes. However, there is one more question that we need to ask before we can make this decision. When Graham dies, is there likely to be any inheritance tax to pay? If we assume Graham's home is worth £600,000 and his buy-to-let is worth £150,000, to work out his potential IHT bill if he were to die today, we take the total value of his assets, subtract pensions away from this because pensions fall outside of your estate for inheritance tax purposes, which would then leave a taxable estate of £780,000. He has an inheritance tax nil rate band of £325,000, and if he leaves his home to a descendant, he'll also get the residence nil rate band of an additional £175,000. So in all, he can pass on £500,000 IHT free, but the other £280,000 would be taxable at 40%, which would leave an inheritance tax bill of £112,000. With this in mind, if Graham takes the remaining shortfall from his pension, it won't reduce his inheritance tax liability, but if he takes it from his ISA, it will. Not only that, but if Graham dies before the age of 75, his beneficiaries will inherit his pension as a tax-free cash lump sum, which means that he's probably better off preserving his pension to retain its advantages and take the cash from his ISA. However, if he was really concerned about IHT, perhaps because he's unwell and not expecting to live very long, there may even be an argument not to take any money out of his pension at all and instead just take it all from his ISA. This decision framework sounds really simple, because it is. The hard part, though, is trying to project into the future and understand what tax you might pay, which is why it's so important that you spend the time thinking about what you want your life to look like in 5, 10, 15 years' time, where you want to live, what you want to be doing, and most importantly, what cash flow you think you'll need to sustain yourself. I know that thinking far into the future is hard, but this does not need to be perfect. All we're asking is whether, by making this decision on the balance of probabilities, am I likely to pay more tax now or in the future? This is much more of an art than a science, so all you can really hope to do is to use the facts that you have available, make sensible assumptions and reasonable decisions, and just accept that you're not going to get it right every time. Graham's situation is obviously pretty simple, but if you have a lot more assets, especially taxable assets like property, general investment accounts, or investment bonds, this can get a lot more complicated. But for 95% of people, this 3-bucket decision framework is all you need. Now, before we get on to the most important step, step number 7, I'm sure you're thinking, but James, how the hell are we supposed to plan for the future when come October 30th, Rachel Reeves is going to move all the goalposts? I hear you. It makes things really difficult. But unfortunately, this is just what governments do. They change tax rules all the time. So when you're trying to think long term and project 10 or 20 years into the future, I think you should assume that the rules are as they are now. If you don't, you'll just tie yourself in knots and never be able to make any decisions. Although I think that as a final lens, it's worth recognizing the broad trends that we're seeing. Taxes, in general, are going up. State pensions are being pushed further out, and things like buy-to-let property are continuing to get squeezed. In the short term, we have a good idea of what taxes are in scope for this budget, but we can only speculate as to what the actual changes will be. With things like inheritance tax or capital gains tax, they could implement changes overnight to try and prevent circumvention. But you really need to think before you act, because imagine if you sold something now thinking that you're going to pay less CGT, but then they bring back in indexation relief and you'd actually have been better off waiting. But can you imagine the chaos that would be caused if they removed pension tax-free cash overnight? Millions of retirees' plans would be ruined. That is why when they make changes like this, they normally exempt those that are right on the cusp or bring those changes in slowly over time. Whatever happens on the 30th of October, I expect these changes to be big and nuanced. So I'm not going to do a video on it right away, not until we have all of the details, which might not be for a few weeks afterwards. But if you want to get my initial take on the day, I will be sending out a newsletter, so you can sign up for that via the link in the description. So now for the final step. The plan is in year 1 for Graham to take £7,427 from his defined contribution pension and £25,500 from his ISA. We don't know exactly what the plan will be for year 2, but if the rules stay the same as they are now, we'll probably do a similar thing and for the years that follow, which tells us that over the next 5 years or so, Graham is likely to deplete his ISA in full. But if Graham has been using his ISA to invest in individual stocks or any purely stock-based fund, is that really the type of investment that he should be holding if he plans to spend that money in the next few years? Almost certainly not. This is the part that so many people get wrong. There is no point doing all of this forecasting and tax planning if the investments that you're using are not suitable for the job that you need them to do. When building an investment portfolio, there are two main options to choose from: stocks and bonds. Stocks have produced phenomenal returns in the past, but in the short term, they are very volatile. So if you have a short investment horizon, less than 5 years, there is a high chance that you could lose money. Bonds, however, in general, have produced lower returns than stocks, but they're much more stable and predictable in the short term. Let's say that based on Graham's attitude to risk and the growth that he needs to achieve his goals, we've decided that a globally diversified portfolio of 60% stocks and 40% bonds is appropriate for him. That's the overall asset allocation that we're looking for. But that does not mean that we have to have the same allocation across each of these buckets. We can shift that allocation so that the buckets he's likely to draw on first have the lower risk investments, so that when he comes to draw on them, he's not likely to get a nasty surprise and find that his account is down by 40%. Choosing what to invest in at retirement is really important, and I've only briefly touched on some of the factors that you need to consider. But what I want you to take away from this video is that this stuff is all connected. If you want to have the right investments, you need to have a tax-efficient drawdown strategy. And to create that, you're going to need to think long-term. You're going to need to spend time thinking about what you want your life to look like in the future and the cash flow that you're going to need to sustain yourself. Of course, it's never going to be perfect. We don't know what is going to happen in the future, but that does not mean that we can't use the information that we have to hand to make better decisions today. In step 4, we assessed whether Graham's spending goals were likely to be sustainable. In this video here, I dive into that process in a lot more detail and look at the different levers that you can pull to boost your income in retirement. So please do check it out. I'll see you there.